Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Ashrafil Anbiya wal Mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammadi wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Amma ba'd. Fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Now, over the past month or so, we have been looking at the topic of medication in Islam. And in particular, over the past few weeks, we have been looking at certain diseases or certain actions or certain ways of life which can lead to a person being affected physically, which can lead to a person being affected spiritually, mentally, morally as well. And we touched on the topic with regards to adultery and fornication, and I mentioned that adultery, fornication leads to various sexual transmitted diseases such as AIDS, HIV, gonorrhea, syphilis, and so on and so forth. Also talked about alcohol, how it affects a person's body, how it affects a person's liver, how it affects the sensitive cells in a person's brain. And in last week's lesson, we were touching on the topic of obesity and lack of exercise and eating too much and how it affects a person physically and also mentally as well. Because as I mentioned, that those who are overweight, they tend to be lazy. And those who tend to be lazy, then their mental capacity also slows down as well. So they find it difficult to think. They find it difficult to kind of motivate themselves. They're always kind of agitated. They always find it difficult to understand. Why? Because of the lack of blood circulating in their brains. But obviously those who engage themselves in physical exercise, those who regularly do exercise, then obviously not only are they keeping fit and looking after themselves, but also it helps them mentally as well. So these were the 2 or 3 topics which I mentioned over the past few weeks. Now in today's lesson, I'm going to touch on 2 or 3 points before we conclude this section of medication, and we'll move on to the next topic next week. Now again, this particular topic, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there would be no need for me to talk about it to Muslims. Because again, what I'm going to talk about today, Muslims weren't really involved in, or Muslims did not have this at home. But over the past few years, we have noticed that in particular the Muslim youth, they kind of think of it to be something cool, think of it to be a fashion statement, think of it to be something like a sign of strength and power to have this around or to have this at home. And basically what I'm going to touch on initially, firstly, is with regards to Muslims keeping dogs as pets at home. So what does Islam say with regards to that? Again, you probably noticed it, that especially many Muslim youth nowadays, you see them strolling in the park with a dog. Now this dog is actually their own dog. It's not like they found it somewhere and they're just taking it for a walk. It's actually their own dog. They have it with them, they have it at home. When they go to sleep, the dog's there in their room. Some have it in the kennel outside. But what we've realized is that very recently, many Muslims having dogs or keeping dogs as pets at home. So obviously the idea of today's topic is obviously to look at it. What is the ruling of keeping dogs at home? And thereafterwards the physical and the spiritual detriment and implication it has to a person's health, to a person's hygiene in having dogs and just being around with dogs. Now, firstly, the ruling or the Islamic stance on keeping dogs as pets at home is something which is unlawful and haram in Islam. And when we look through the books of history, in particular the early period of Islam in Medina Munawwara, we find that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was very, very strict and harsh when it came to keeping dogs. And what exactly happened was that for a few days, Sayyiduna Jibreel alayhi salam did not come to see Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, did not come to visit Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam at home. So once Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam met Jibreel alayhi salam outside his house, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked him that, look, it's been a few days, why don't you come to visit me at home? Why is it like you always see me outside, or you visit me, or you come to me outside, but you never come to my house as you did before and send or reveal some verses of the Holy Quran? So Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam responded and replied by saying that the reason why I don't come to your house is because there is a puppy, there is a dog which is inside your house, which has hidden underneath your bed. And because of that reason, because it's mentioned in another hadith, لا تدخل الملائكة بيتا فيه كلب, the angels do not enter a house where there is a dog. So because there was a dog and a puppy hidden underneath your bed, that's why I could not enter your house. So then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam realized that actually there's too many dogs around in Medina Munawwara, there's too many puppies in Medina Munawwara. So what he then ordered was that he ordered every single Sahabi and companion to kill any dogs they see. So any dogs, whether it belonged to old women, whether it was for hunting purposes, whether it was a sheep dog, whether it was like guide dogs for the blind, every type of dog Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam ordered that basically kill it. It was later on when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw that the hurmat, the prohibition with regards to dogs, keeping dogs, slowly has become engraved in the hearts of the Sahabas. Only then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam allowed that, okay, for hifazat wala kutta, i.e. dogs for protection, security dogs, sheep dogs, or say dogs for hunting purposes, only then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam allowed it. But initially, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was very strict when it came to dogs or dog-related issues. Very similar to alcohol, as I mentioned before, that initially Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when the prohibition came, was very strict with regards to alcohol. To the extent, as mentioned in the hadith, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam prohibited making beverages, i.e. nabis we call it in Arabic, in containers used for alcohol. So basically those containers or glasses where the Arabs in the past used to use for drinking alcohol, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam even prohibited the Sahabas from drinking halal stuff from those haram containers or utensils or vessels which were initially used to make alcohol. But then obviously later on Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam allowed that, to the extent in the Hanafi fiqh in particular that it is even permissible to make vinegar from alcohol. So all these kinds of vinegars we see in the shops, white wine vinegar, red wine vinegar. So in the Hanafi fiqh that is permissible and lawful to consume, because the way they make it is that it's actually alcohol firstly, it's wine, but they remove the intoxication and whatever is left over is vinegar. Then to consume that is also lawful and permissible. But initially even that was also unlawful and haram, to show the severity of alcohol. So anything alcohol related, Prophet ﷺ prohibited. Later on, certain aspects of alcohol with regards to using the utensils, with regards to making vinegar, Rasulullah ﷺ allowed. So exactly same with regards to the topic of killing dogs or dog related issues. Rasulullah ﷺ was very strict, but later on the rule slightly got relaxed in terms of keeping dogs for hunting purposes or for protection, for security, that was allowed. But anything else, in terms of keeping a dog as a pet, then that is strictly prohibited and that is strictly unlawful. Now this takes me on to the next point, and that is that it is the belief of us Muslims that whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us to do, whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made haram, and similarly whatever Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has made haram, remember that what they have made haram wo hikmat se khali nahi hai. In other words, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made something haram, you know that there must be some special reasons why this is haram. 1400 years ago we may not know that why this is haram, but later on in time you will realize why this was made haram, why this was made unlawful. certain things which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may have decreed for us. At that time we may be thinking, why is this? But later on in our lives we realize that actually it's good this didn't happen. A good example will be like with brothers and sisters, that there may be a particular brother who wants to marry a particular sister. So he wants to marry this particular girl, but either the girl's family are saying no or the guy's family is saying no. So then that person, he gets upset that, why are the family saying no? I want to marry this particular girl. Why is her family saying no? Why is my family saying no? So it doesn't happen. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had decreed to not to happen. And what Allah had ordered there or decreed there, hikmat se khali nahi hai. In other words, that there's some wisdom there. So at that time, when we find out from the family that no, you can't go ahead with this wedding, it hits us, we get upset, we get disheartened, we get despondent. We don't really know the reasons why. But later on in our life, 10, 20 years later, then we think to ourselves, you know what, it actually worked out for the best. I got married to somebody else, we have children, we are happy. It actually worked out for the best. So exactly same when it comes to rulings about the Sharia, that whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made haram, there's some wisdom there. Whatever Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that this is unlawful, there is some wisdom and hikmah behind that. Now 1400 years ago, people didn't know the wisdom or the hikmah as why are Muslims so strict when it comes to dogs. The mushrikeens of Makkah, they found this absurd. Dogs, what's wrong with dogs? Why can't we keep it as a pet? Why can't they kind of roam around in our homes? Why can't we sleep with them? Why can't they drink or eat from the same vessels or plates or containers? 1400 years ago, people didn't understand that. Even now, some people don't understand it. But the beauty of the Sharia is that, and I mentioned this point before as well, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, remember these hadiths which I'm going to mention, tells us that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is a true prophet and a messenger of Allah. He's not a kahin, he's not a fortune teller. If he was a fortune teller, if he was someone who was lying, someone who was taking advantage of the situation in Arabia at that time, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wouldn't have said these hadiths which I'm going to mention to you. He wouldn't have predicted these hadiths which I'm going to mention to you. Because 1400 years ago, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said a beautiful hadith about dogs. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that if a dog licks a vessel, if a dog licks a plate, or if a dog was to drink from a plate or drink from a vessel, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned that firstly, rub that plate with soil and then wash it 7 times. These are the words of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that rub that plate with soil and thereafterwards wash that plate 7 times. And there's also hadiths as well of washing it 3 times. But in this hadith of Sahih Muslim, it's mentioned wash it 7 times. Now the Arabs in those days, they didn't understand that. Why 7 times in particular? Why do you have to rub it with soil? Now seriously, if somebody was to ask you that this hadith, why do you have to rub it with soil? Why can't we use liquid or bleach or something? Why do we have to use soil? 1400 years ago, people didn't understand that. But now, through medical research, the scientists, the doctors, they mention the wisdom why you use soil, which I'll come back to later, and also the wisdom why you have to wash the plate 7 times. Now, why you have to wash it more than 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Why you have to wash it rigorously and properly, because of the diseases the dog's saliva can transmit to other people and to other things. Now just one point here, remember the lu'ab or the saliva of a dog, we call it najasul ayn, it's najas de ghaliza, which means that if it comes onto your clothes, it's najas, you have to wash it. It's similar to like urine, the same way urine comes onto your clothes, you have to wash it. Is similar to semen. If it comes onto your clothes, you have to wash it. Similarly, the saliva of a dog, that is najasul ayn, you have to wash it. If the body of the dog touches you, that is not napak, that is not najas. So just for example, you're kind of walking in the park and a dog comes and it kind of like, sticks its body or kind of uses its body to kind of touch your body, then that's not impure, that's not najas. However, if the saliva of the dog was to touch your body, then that is najas and you have to wash that. Now let's have a look at the saliva. Now, as I was saying, Prophet ﷺ said that the dog's saliva is najas. Why? Why did he say it's najas? Now, when we look at modern research, they tell us that inside dogs, there is a worm inside the dog's intestines called the roundworm. And this roundworm comes out when the dog passes feces. So when the dog passes feces and stool, then in its stool, there are eggs of roundworms. Like roundworm eggs are inside the stool and inside the feces. Now, there's nothing wrong with that at that particular moment in time. But you probably realize that dogs, they have a disgusting habit. And that is that dogs sometimes they lick their own backside. You probably see that sometimes they kind of like move their leg the other way and they kind of like lick their own back. Now what happens is that when dogs, when they lick their own backside, so on the backside there are that eggs of roundworms. You know those roundworm eggs, because obviously they don't go for stinja, they don't do stinja after they pass feces, so it's all there stuck. So then what happens is that roundworm, the eggs of roundworms, it goes onto the dog's saliva. It goes into its mouth, it goes into its saliva, mixed with other things in the saliva. Thereafterwards, when the dog now licks a vessel or a plate or a container, or when it drinks water. Now, if somebody doesn't wash the plate properly and the saliva of the dog's there, or a more kind of practical example would be that the owner of the dog, what he does is that he's eating crisp with his own right hand, and then he'll get a crisp out from the packet and he'll give it to the dog to eat. So then what happens is that on the owner's hands, there's dog saliva, he then puts into a crisp and then he has it himself. Or sometimes like we see a non-Muslim, say a chip shop owner, and he's got a dog at the back. So what's he doing is that he's kind of like touching the dog's saliva and he's also serving chips as well at the same time. So then what happens is that through the saliva of the dog, which is either on the vessel or on the plate, which hasn't been washed properly, or it's on the hand of the owner, it then gets mixed with the food. Now when it then gets mixed with the food and people then eat that, when that food which has got the saliva of the dog mixed with the roundworm, when it goes into a person's stomach, into the intestines, then that roundworm from the egg, it kind of like disintegrates the eggs. The roundworm then kind of spreads into a person's blood and into a person's mucus. And this leads to two possible illnesses, two possible bimaris. One is not that common, which is called water sac illness or water sac disease, which is some kind of problems with the woman's fetus and with the woman's ovaries. But the second illness or disease which may cause from that is something very, very severe, which we call rabies. Now, what is rabies? Rabies, that's why if somebody gets bitten by a dog and this dog has rabies, or it doesn't have to be dog, it could be anything, it could be like bats even, but if somebody gets bitten by them, then there is a chance that that particular person could develop rabies. And rabies basically is where a person, he gets agitated, he gets frustrated, he suffers, this kind of a paranoia in a way that someone's going to harm him, someone's going to attack him. And in some cases, what happens is that a person, he gets scared of water. So in other words, like he's in a bed, whatever, hospital bed, or he's at home, and he gets scared of water. And because of this paranoia of water and people around and this kind of terrifying feeling he gets, then eventually within 2 to 10 days, that person, he dies. So this happens through, obviously, having too much contact with dogs, and in particular when their infection, when their saliva spreads to other, utensils, plates, and then we eat from it, then this is what could happen to an individual. Now, as I was saying before, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said this 1400 years ago. When Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said it, people were like kind of amazed. People were kind of shocked, like, what's Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam trying to say here? Even 20, 30 years ago, when the scientists didn't do their research properly, they couldn't understand this particular hadith. But obviously, modern research has shown that this what exactly happens. That if you don't wash the plates properly, if you don't wash the area of the saliva of the dog, then this what will happen. That it can easily transmit diseases, severe diseases, from one person to another person, from one place to another. Now going back to the hadith I mentioned earlier, that when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that you have to wash the plate 7 times, and not only that, you have to rub the plate once with soil. Now why soil in particular? Now again, sometimes if you speak to people now about using soil, they say that doesn't make sense, because soil, naturally they take the meaning that soil is something dirty, it makes something muddy. How can you use soil to clean something? Now again, research has shown that soil is a substance of the earth, that there is no, like, soil is something where there are no diseases inside soil. In other words, soil is something which can be used to eradicate diseases. It can be used to eradicate illnesses, germs and bacteria. And again, this is not with this particular hadith, but there's also another hadith as well in Sunan Abu Dawood, where it's mentioned that when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would do istinja, so after he would do istinja, it's mentioned the hadith, his left hand, he would rub it on the soil and then he would wash it. So again, from that particular hadith, why did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam rub his left hand on the soil? They didn't have soap in those days, but Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would rub his left hand on the soil. Why? Because the soil is spark, it's pure, and it takes away the bacteria, the smell, the foul smell, the bacteria or the germs of the left hand when using for istinja. Similarly, that's not the only hadith, but there's also another hadith of Sunan Abu Dawood that is mentioned that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would use soil to like cover his body, and then he would perform ghusl over it. So you would use that as like the same way you use soap to like put over our body. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would use the soil or the mud from the diwar. He would then put it over his body like this, and then obviously would use water to rinse off the soil. So soil, as I was saying, is that something which eradicates illnesses, eradicates bacteria, takes away germs. So therefore, in that particular hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that when you're washing the container or the utensil where there's dog saliva on, so what you firstly should do is that you should remove it firstly with soil, rub the impurity away, the saliva away with soil, and thereafter wash it 7 times. And in that particular way, inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will remove the effects of dogs and their saliva from the plates, from the utensils which we are eating from. But in a nutshell, going back to the main point which I mentioned earlier, is that keeping dogs as pets in Islam is haram. Now again, somebody may be thinking, why is it haram, why is it unlawful? But from the explanation I gave, we can understand why it's unlawful. At that time, people don't understand the ill healths and the consequences. But if we look at it systematically, and the hadiths which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said or stated about dogs, we can realize that there's actually khair and there's actually goodness that we don't keep dogs as pets. So that is one particular animal. Number 2, another quick point very quickly I want to mention, and again this is all through the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now again, there's another hadith, this is from Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that do not urinate in still water. So water like a pond, do not urinate inside a pond, and then فَيَغْتَسِلُ فِيهِ, and then perform ghusl inside that pond. There's also another hadith where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that do not dip your hand inside water before you wash it. In other words, when you wake up in the morning, wash your hands properly and then dip your hands inside water. Why? Because you do not know what kind of germs or bacteria your hand is carrying. So 2 hadiths. Again, these are authentic hadiths from Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that not to urinate in still water or in ponds or rivers, and thereafterwards perform ghusl inside it. And number 2, the second hadith, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that not to place or dip your hands in some kind of bowl of water without washing it prior. Now again, when these hadiths were said by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam over 1400 years ago, people did not understand the wisdom. Like, oh, why can't we urinate, inside a pond? Why can't we urinate inside, say for example, a still water or inside a river? People sometimes do nowadays, like they kind of urinate near a river, they kind of pass feces or stool near a river. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam over 1400 years ago said that don't do that. Now why did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam say? Again, we can see that from the modern research that when people's feces and urine gets mixed with natural water, or in particular gets mixed with drinking water, then it leads to 2 illnesses. One is cholera and the other one is called typhoid, which is like high fever. So when does that happen? And that's why you see in the news in particular that where there's a flood, where there's a tsunami or where there's a flood, they'll always say that there's a risk or there's a danger of cholera or typhoid in those places. Why? Because when there's a flood, then the dirty water, i.e. the sewage water, gets mixed with the clean water, and then obviously people, they got no other clean water there to drink, so whatever water they find, they drink that, but that water is actually contaminated with people's urine, with people's feces. As I just explained about dog's feces, how dangerous it is. Similarly, humans' feces, that also leads out a lot of toxics, a lot of chemicals, which if it gets mixed with water and food, it could actually affect a person and an individual. So look at this hadith again, 1400 years ago. Again, these hadiths tells us the truthfulness of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the haqqaniyat of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because if he was all a made-up prophet, then he wouldn't have predicted such a thing. But actually Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that don't urinate in baths and in these kind of places where people are doing ghusl. Why? Because if the urine gets mixed with the water, then it comes onto you, and thereafterwards it can lead to various other kind of diseases, other kind of sicknesses. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned that over 1400 years ago. And that's why when we see nowadays that many of the food poisoning which happens, sometimes the food poison happens because the food may not be cooked properly or it's raw. But also another cause of food poisoning is basically where food handlers, they don't wash their hands properly. That's why when you go to like kitchens in takeaways and restaurants, they after everything there's always a sign now that make sure you wash your hands properly after you go to the toilet and so on. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that when 1400 years ago, that make sure that you wash your hands properly before you dip your hands in any other kind of food or any other kind of water. Why? Because if you don't wash your hands properly, there's germs there on your hands. In particular, after you've gone to the toilet, there's germs there in your hands. So therefore, if you then dip it into another bowl of water, then that water or the illnesses will then, or the sicknesses will then spread to other kind of places or to other kind of things. So as I was saying, that many of the food poisoning cases, it happens when food handlers, they don't wash their hands properly. Just recently meaning obviously 40, 50 years ago, in actually Scotland, Aberdeen to be more precise, which is a city in Scotland. So it's mentioned that the entire area, or the entire city of Aberdeen, all the people were suffering from food poisoning. So when they obviously, checked everything, when they, backtracked and checked everything, that what is the cause, they found out that there was a food handler who was kind of like giving out all these pasties and so on. He didn't wash his hands properly. So that was the cause which led to most of the people in Aberdeen getting food poisoning from the pasties which he was delivering. Why? Because he didn't wash his hands properly. So what we can understand here is that when it comes to food in particular, make sure that after, for us as well, that sometimes what happens, sometimes when we are in rush, even though the sunnah's there, that we do our istinja, but we don't wash our hands properly. Or some of us don't even use soap or anything. We just quickly rinse our hands and we just go. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned in the sunnah that make sure you clean your hands properly, you wash your hands properly before you touch food, before you do anything. Why? Because if you don't, then the diseases and the sicknesses will spread. So these were one or two points which I mentioned. And remember this topic about illnesses or sicknesses. The main usul or the main point to remember here is we can actually save ourselves from all these bimaris, from all these sicknesses, as long as we are precautious and as long as we protect ourselves from these things. At the very beginning I mentioned about when the cold season comes, then to protect ourselves in terms of wearing warm clothing, in terms of wearing socks, so on and so forth. But also when it comes to these kind of epidemics, typhoid and these kind of illnesses, we can also save ourselves, we can also protect ourselves, as mentioned in a hadith of Sahih Muslim, a very beautiful hadith where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that before you go to sleep, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that, the plates, turn them over. Sometimes at home we leave the plates just like that. After we washed it, we just leave it there on the kitchen sink like that. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, no, turn it upside down. Similarly, glass, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, don't just leave it like that, turn it the other way around. Usko ulta karo, turn it the other way around. Similarly, with other kind of spoons and so on, put it into a drawer, protect it. Why? The hadith then goes on to say why? Because there is a time in the year, this is the words of the hadith, there is a time in the year where there is an epidemic, i.e. there is a disease or there is a sickness, and it is possible that that sickness which is floating in the atmosphere may come and fall into that plate, may come and fall into that glass, may come and fall onto that spoon or that fork or that knife, and then afterwards you eat from it, and then you fall ill and you then fall sick. And that's why when you speak to doctors, they'll tell you that certain types of illnesses come in certain months in the year. Take example like measles, that normally comes in September and October. That's why you always see school children, they're always getting measles injections when in September, October. Sometimes certain fevers, they happen in the summer. Certain sicknesses, viruses happen in the cold season like in December, January. So look at the words of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He himself has predicted that there are certain sicknesses or illnesses which come during certain parts of the year. So to save yourself from that, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that you need to do precautions, you need to do ihtiyat, you need to protect yourself, and the way you do it is to make sure that the plates, all these kind of things are covered properly. Make sure you don't just leave it flat like that, so that these sicknesses come and then hit the plate. Similarly, spoons, make sure they're all covered. So, and these are the precaution, because remember, Islam or our belief isn't just like we just do tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What we need to do is that firstly we take the means and then do tawakkul in Allah. We can't just jump off a roof and say, yeah, tawakkul in Allah, we're going to save ourselves. No, we have to do the means firstly, and then we can place our trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So exactly these topics which I mentioned, the whole idea is obviously to make brothers aware of the sicknesses and these kind of diseases, how we should lead our life. Because remember, leading our life doesn't just mean praying our 5 daily prayers. That's just like an entire way of life in terms of food, in terms of habit, in terms of certain practices we shouldn't do. So as long as we lead our life, then inshallah we'll be able to be successful in this world. We'll be able to continuously remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because as all the brothers know, that remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, abiding by the sunnah, following, doing istiqamat, being steadfast on the straight path, these are the two things which will lead us to Jannah, lead us to closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So may Allah give us the tawfiq to act as we said, wa akhir da'wana.